apostolic church structure. And quick review, which I know I've gone over every single class, but it's kind of the main takeaway from this. What is a bishop? Why do we call Brother Hanson a bishop? Bishop is the overseer of the entire body that's here associated with this church and all the different ministries that go on. Then, of course, we have elders, and those oversee different areas within the church, whether that's a group of people or a group of ministries or whatever. And then deacons, call those the ministry facilitators, and they're right there working, leading a prayer group or Bible study or ministry, whatever it is, reporting to an elder who then is reporting to the bishop. So that's a really brief summary. So the question we're going to ask today, which I think a lot of people wonder when they come to Acts 2 or they hear us talk about Bishop Hanson, is what happened to the pastor? So who's the pastor around here? And that's a great question, because there's definitely nothing wrong with calling Bishop Hanson pastor, but we do call him Bishop Hanson. And so why is that? What's really being asked is, who's in charge around here? That's a good thing to know. If you're going to be at a church, you want to know who's in charge. Who do I go to when I need prayer for sickness? That's a good thing to know. If you're sick, you want someone to pray for you. You want the pastor to pray for you, but there's no pastor here, is there? Who do I ask about God's will for my life? That's a really important thing to know if you're going to be a part of a church. Or someone gave me a quote-unquote word. What do I do with that? And maybe you're just thinking, this is weird. How come no one in this church is called pastor? So that's kind of what you're really asking when you're asking what happened to the pastor. So people, they come to Acts 2, especially if they come from other churches that use different titles or different structures, will have trouble understanding, why don't we call Bishop Hanson pastor, and what's his role versus a pastor's role? Why is it different? Is it the same thing? Is there a pastor here? Shorthand, if you want to just zone out for the rest of this lesson, the shorthand answer is the pastor's role here at Acts 2 is really fulfilled by the bishop. So if you're at another church, the pastor's in charge. Here, the bishop's in charge. So that's the shorthand answer, is our bishop fulfills the same role that what's called a pastor does at other churches. So going past just the shorthand answer, because there are some real nuances and some reasons that God has led Bishop Hanson to set it up in this way and with this structure that we have, which again may not be right for everybody, but it's what God's given us here, and so we want to follow what God has given us here and get the most out of it. So there's several ideas about how churches should be run, about how churches should be organized, and you could read, there's books upon books about there. There's hundreds of, probably thousands of opinions out there that you could research and subscribe to, and obviously we can't handle all of those, and a lot of those are probably really bad ideas, and some of them are probably good ideas. Some of them maybe are better than what we have, but this is what God's given us. So we want to understand it so that we can get the most out of it. So a common idea or thing that you may come across, idea number one, there's basically a pastor, and there's a building, and there's a congregation of saints. And so that's the way God has set a lot of churches up, and that's fine, but of course one man and one building can only hold so many and can only reach so much. So there might be a growth problem. If there's just one person who's the only minister in a church, how many people can he have a relationship with? How many people can he truly pastor? It's maybe a decent amount, but at some point there probably needs to be other leaders to help the ministry go forward and help more people reach. And again, that may be God's plan for another church, but for us, we feel it's something different. So then there's another idea, and this one is maybe a little controversial. Some people believe that the Bible teaches about this thing called the fivefold ministry. And so there's an idea that, if someone has this title in that ministry or this title that they've been given, or they're used this way or that way, that means they should be in charge. This person's an apostle, so they should be in charge. Well, I think what you find if you look at the Bible is that's not really what the Bible teaches about that, and it's also just not a great way to organize leadership. So what has God given us? For us, the bishop, elder, and deacons are the offices of authority here in this local church, if you will. Then there's all these other ministries that take place. And the main one I'll talk a little bit about today is the fivefold ministry, but there's all these other giftings, all these other things that take place, miracles, and God gives people special gifts to be administrative and reach out and organize, and there's all these different giftings that God has given the body, and that's all great. We want all of that. We encourage everyone's ministry to be developed, but regardless of whether one person's good at this type of ministry or they're fluent in this type of ministry, that's not who determines the authority or who's in charge. Use that kind of casually, but that's really what authority comes down to, is who's in charge. All those ministries are great. We want all of that to happen. We want all the gifts of the Spirit. We want all this stuff happening, but none of that determines who's in charge in this structure. That comes from the bishop, the elders, which support him, and the deacons, which report to the elders. That's the flow of authority. So let's look at that a little bit closer. What's important to understand, and I won't go too deep into this, if you want to learn or research more, Bishop Hanson has written about the fivefold ministry, and that's not the focus of this, so I won't talk about that too much, but I'll just to try to establish the difference that we have today. The office, if you think of the word office, that speaks of authority, that speaks of being appointed to a position, right? We have public officers that are overseeing transportation or whatever. What about ministry? What does that mean? Ministry is about a gifting or a flow, or think of it as a function. So if someone has a certain ministry, they may be called. In fact, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 8, when this fivefold ministry is introduced, it says, "Wherefore he hath ascended, he ascended on high, he led captivity captive, and gave gifts unto men." Not, he put people, and it goes on to say apostle, prophet, all these different things. Not put people in positions of authority, but he gave gifts. So those are giftings, those are functions, those are types of ministry that we need and we want in our body to happen, to be fully apostolic. But those don't determine who's in charge. Well, I have this gift, so that makes me special. That means I should be in charge. I have this gift. I'm really in tune with God. Now, that's great. We want people to be in tune with God. We want people to hear from God. We want that. But that's not authority. That's the gift. So these two ideas of all these different ministries, whether it's the fivefold ministry or all the other types of ministries that the Bible talks about, those are all really important. But they don't determine authority. They just determine how God is going to use someone. When we've read these verses throughout this class before in 1 Timothy chapter 3, Timothy said it's a good thing for a man to be desired the office of a bishop. So they use that word office associated with bishop, and elders are similar to bishops in the way that they're used, except they have a little bit less authority. And if we read in Acts chapter 6, I believe it is, the first deacons, it says they were appointed and they took care of making sure that everyone had the food as it was distributed, that no one was left out. And we read that verse earlier. So this idea of gifts versus offices, it's really important to understand, because we made it really made a point of emphasis here that we encourage people to be. It's not a type of thing where, well, here's the minister or the pastor or the ministry, and they're really used of God, and then everyone else just sits on the pews and observes and is entertained and is, hopefully makes it to heaven. Everyone has a ministry. God wants to use everyone somehow. God has something special, I believe, a special talent or a special maybe way of praying, or a special group that person can reach. Everyone is a part of the body on purpose. And we value all those things. We encourage all those things. We want all those things. But those don't determine what we do. That comes from the authority, the office of the bishop, the office of the elders, the appointment of deacons to those positions. A gift or a function is how God flows through someone. God maybe uses someone to start new works or start Bible studies. Maybe someone is used especially in a gift of the Spirit, tongues interpretation. Maybe someone reaches the lost, or someone's an excellent teacher. Someone's really good at just coming along a new person and nurturing them and helping them to grow. Those are the gifts, the functions of how God uses, the ways that God uses different people. The bishop, elder, deacon here at Acts 2 is how the authority flows and how direction is given. So let's look real quickly at what I have next. So here's a way maybe to think about it. I like visuals, so here's a visual that may help. We have bishop, elder, and deacon. We looked at a whole bunch of depictions of this, and Bishop Hanson, he's, like I said, if you don't remember all the teaching on the bishop, he kind of fulfills the role of a pastor. He's overseeing, that word bishop means overseeing all the ministries that are happening here. There's elders, there's deacons. We've talked about that a lot. So then let's introduce all these other ministries, because there's all these other ideas, and we want to make sure we have it straight. So, there's apostles and prophets and evangelists and teachers and pastors. And so as we look, that second idea was that should determine who's in charge. We don't look at it that way here. We don't teach it that way here. Bishop could be any one of these. He could be, wow, he's a great teacher. Wow, he's a great prophet, whatever. That doesn't matter. That's great, but it doesn't matter. He's the bishop. An elder could come along, and I just randomly fill these all in. Maybe an elder is an apostle. Well, that's great, but that doesn't determine he's still an elder. He still has a certain role and a certain position here in the body. And be honest, if you're around here any length of time, we don't call people by these titles. Brother Hanson doesn't, set up, this is the prophet section over here, this is the section over here. It just happens. It just naturally happens in the background. And so we're not, some ideas for church structure would really invert this, and I think I'm messing up my mic here, would invert this, but on the left is how, I'll just stand here, I guess. On the left is how authority flows. On the right, many different ministries. They're all great. They don't determine authority. Again, it's not just leaders in our church. There's other peoples. There could be other ministers that isn't one of those offices. There could be, obviously, there's saints. There's youth. Well, if you look in the Bible, in the New Testament, it talks about giving, the gift of giving. That would be a great gift to have, right? Who wants that? To give sacrificially, that sounds like a great gift. For some reason, people don't get as excited about that gift as others. But the Bible talks about the gifts of the help. There's all the gifts of the Spirit that are listed. All great things. We all want it. But none of that matters when it comes to the structure of authority. And so I could be sitting over here on the front row, and whoa, God just boom, blows me away and just talks to me, and just I see a vision, and it's just amazing. It's like where the church is going to be in 5 years, and it's great, and I can start telling everybody about it. But that's not my position to give the direction for where the church is. I'm not the bishop. The bishop, it's his job to cast the vision for where the church is going, to point the direction, to tell us what we should be focusing on, to observe as God leads them that there's this danger coming or this attack coming against the church, and to point us in the right direction. And so I could bring that insight that maybe God has given me and submit it to him, and maybe it will help him. And so that's a great gift. That's a great experience. We want that to happen to people, but only if it's then submitted to how the authority works. So there's gifts, there's authority, there's all this stuff, but ultimately what it comes down to is the structure that God has given us. And that's why this class is so important, that we understand it here. It's not about discouraging anyone from being used. It's not about trying to mute or silence anyone. We want everyone to have their ministry. It just has to fit in the structure that God has given us. So real quickly, since we're on this topic, give you a quick, this is not an in-depth study at all, and if you were to interview 100 preachers or 100 pastors, you'd get 100 different interpretations on this idea of the fivefold ministry, but this is just how we teach it and how we think about it here at Acts 2. An apostle, what does that mean? It's someone who's sent forward. It's someone who's sent out. The word doesn't mean the person who's in charge just because it's listed first in the verse. You might think of a naval fleet going out from an empire to act as an embassy at a colony or something. It's someone who's sent to a place. Often you see this ministry involved in pioneering new churches. That is different from the 12 apostles. Let's look at the next one. Prophet is a vessel of communication. The word doesn't mean that it's someone who tells everyone what they should be doing. It's just a way that God communicates. Of course, prophet, we know that's a discernment of future or spiritual events. In the Old Testament, you see that they would wage war on idolatry, or they may set in order. So God might use a minister prophetically to have special insight of how things should be corrected and changed. People may prophesy. Doesn't mean that they're prophets. There's a gift of prophecy. Again, real quick, very basic study here. Evangelist, one who announces the gospel. Now, that's interesting because we all should be people who announce the gospel. Every saint is called to announce the gospel. Just as I believe everyone, God could use any saint in many of the gifts or many of these ministries. But you may find that one individual kind of tends towards a certain avenue or a certain way. There's people who just bring people to church all the time. They're just great soul winners. And that's awesome. Now, each of us should be doing our very best to bring people to church, to witness to people. But there's people who just seem to be open to being used in that way more than others. And so that's important because they have a special role in the body. We need that. We need growth. Of course, the messenger is important as well as the message. They're a preacher of good news. Doesn't just mean someone who travels around and preaches. It's someone who announces the gospel. The pastor. So this, of course, is a really important one for us to study because our idea today is, all right, who is the pastor? How come there's not a pastor here? What that word basically translates to is a herdsman or a shepherd. So a shepherd guides, tends, and feeds the flock. They're watching over it. They're feeding it. They're giving it nourishment. A pastor's role, when they preach, they're bringing forward that spiritual food, that spiritual sustenance that the flock needs. They're also guiding over it, protecting it from attacks. If as was mentioned this morning, David is protecting his sheep, and a lion or a bear comes against them. That's part of the pastor's role. But we also, so Near Eastern shepherds would watch against enemies, attackers, defend from attackers, heal wounded and sick sheep, trying to nurture them back to full health, find and save lost or trapped sheep, love them, share their lives. Like shepherds were living with their sheep. Like wasn't, like they just part-time job and punch in for a few hours and then go home. Like they were with their sheep. The attack might come in the middle of the night. A shepherd was with their sheep. They earn the sheep's trust. Of course, the sheep know their voice. So one thing that might be helpful to understand is maybe, I don't want to say this will happen for sure, I have no idea, but because of our size, we have Bishop Hanson, and he's, of course, a bishop, but he also, in a lot of ways, fulfills the role of a pastor because our size, we have not a huge church. However, if one of our, I don't want to call it a sister church, but Antioch is Brother Wright's church down in Maryland, and of course, Brother Wright is taught a lot of this and is Brother Hanson's pastor, and so we maybe do some things similar that they do. And my understanding in Antioch is that Bishop Wright is the bishop, while his son, David Wright, is the pastor. So what's the distinction there? As a bishop, he oversees everything that happens. As far as I know, ultimately, he kind of has the final say. He still has that authority, right, where I'm sure he's not making every decision. There's tons of, it's a big church, lots of congregations and different sites. There's tons of stuff that happens that I'm sure he's not personally involved in at all. But ultimately, he has the authority to say, this is what we're doing, this is what we're not doing. God wants us to start having church on this night as opposed to the other. God wants us to do this as opposed to the other. But the pastor is his son, David Wright, and he's the one who's typically preaching at their services, feeding the flock, ministering to the flock. And so you can see how the bishop and the pastor could work together. And if Brother Hanson here kind of fulfills both those roles where he is the bishop over all the ministries, but he's also typically preaching here on Sunday morning, feeding the flock. And in their situation, they have a different situation, but that's an example of how it might work. So you can see how the two ideas, they're not opposed to each other. They can fit together very well. And then finally, the teacher. A teacher is one who illuminates, interprets, illuminates, instructs so that others can acquire truth. Teachers might be more the ones who present the strong meat. Maybe evangelist presents the milk to newer ones. And of course, teachers are responsible for making disciples. So what I'm trying to communicate with all these, and as I said, if you were to go out and do your own research, you'd come across 100 different opinions and 100 different ways of teaching. And if another pastor teaches a different way in his church, that's right for them, I guess. But for us, this is the way that we look at it here, and that we teach it here. And so there's these giftings. There's many other giftings that we might get to. When you read throughout the New Testament, there's the gifts of the Spirit. There's all this stuff. That's all important. But at the end of the day, whether a minister is a teacher, or he's a soul winner, or he's good at administrative stuff, or he's good at marketing, or he's a prophet, or whatever, that person fits into the structure somewhere. And that's the important thing to remember. All these things, all this stuff that God's doing, all these ministries that are going on, they fit into the structure. Just as we looked at in a much more practical level, all the different prayer groups and the nursing home ministry and Power New England, all these different things, those real practical, on-the-ground ministries that some of them are, some we're believing for, some we're already seeing. Those all fit into the structure somehow. So does these kind of spiritual ministries as well. So a couple more examples to try to put some illustrations to this. So the office or the authority versus the gifting or the function. Well, in the military, as I understand it, you have a group of soldiers, and say you have a small unit that's going out to do a mission. So maybe you have 10 or 12 guys, or how many ever. You might have in that little squad, that little team, you might have a sniper, and you might have a demolitions expert, and you might have a communications expert. There might be a medic, all these different things. And maybe the sniper one day maybe the sniper's the private, but one day he says, man, I'm just so good. I can just zone in. I've got all these confirmed kills. I'm just this elite sniper. I think I should decide what we do with our mission. Well, if he's a private, and the medic, that guy, he's not even good with weapons. He just, bandages people up or whatever. But he's a sergeant. Is that sergeant who is a medic, is he going to look at the private just because he's a really skilled sniper? Is he going to say, you know what, you're a sharpshooter. We better listen to you. I don't think so. Rank determines the authority in the military. They're going out on a mission. The sergeant is going to be in charge. As soldiers, you got to know, you don't sit around and argue about orders that are given, because that could be the difference between life or death. An order is given, you execute it, you go out. So that's an example of how rank determines authority. Skill set is a gifting. Here in our church, someone might have they might just see angels and just be 100% tuned into the Spirit. That's great. They have a great ministry, a great gifting. God could really use that. That doesn't mean that they're the bishop. There might be a deacon overseeing the prayer group, and that deacon is he's just about as thick-headed, as unspiritual as you could get, but you know what? He's the deacon in charge of that prayer group. So that person who is just so used of God, they need to submit themselves to the authority and the structure that's put in place. And really, that's for their own protection. Because submitting to the spiritual authority that you're given will protect you. It provides a covering. So that's one example. Another example, I used to work at the great store of Kohl's, where you can expect great things. And, so there's a lot of stories I could tell from there, which wouldn't have anything to do with this, but some really fun times there. I got my first exposure to Black Friday. I'd never gone Black Friday shopping myself, because I don't not really interested at all. Doesn't sound like a good time to me. But when you're on the other side, where you're an employee and the crowds are just running through the doors at you, it's really something to see. So anyways, when you work in retail, and probably true in many other jobs, there's different departments throughout the store. So there's the home and kids, there's the ladies' clothes, there's the men's clothes, there's the shoes, all these different departments. And each one of them has a manager. And then there's associates that work in that department. So on a typical night, maybe if it's a quiet night, we're a couple hours before we close, not too much going on, not a Black Friday night, I might be the person in the shoe department, and then maybe there's someone else over, another associate in kids, and another one in the warehouse, and a couple cashiers, and a customer service person, and maybe there's a manager over home and kids. And each one of these departments, we all are trained in our own departments. I know where the shoes go. I can try to find what you're looking for. I can go in the back and pull out the right number. I'm trained. That's my specialty. That's my gifting, if you will, and working in the shoe department. But that doesn't mean I'm the manager of the store. The manager of the store might not really know anything about shoes. That might not be what they're good at. They might be over in the kids' toys section, something totally different than the shoe section where I work. But you know what? Even if I know more about shoes than the manager, the person who has the rank, sure, they might look for my opinion on do we have that shoe in the back or not. But when it comes down to making a decision, to making a customer happy, the manager is going to make the decision, even if they don't know as much as I know. And people sometimes will have that attitude towards spiritual authority. Oh, they don't know what I know, and God spoke to me, and da-da-da. That's great. That's awesome. But you haven't been put in a position of authority. And so that gifting, that specialty, while it's so good and it's so valuable, it needs to be submitted, or else you won't be able to help and minister the body, because ultimately it won't be a benefit if that's not in place. There's so many other gifts and ministries throughout the Old Testament, so many valid ministries we find. In Romans chapter 12 gives a great picture of it. For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. For we have many members in one body, and all members have not the same office. So we, being many, are one body in Christ, and everyone members one of another, having then gifts differing according to the grace that is given to us. Whether prophesy, let us prophesy according to the proportion of the faith. Or ministry, let us wait on our ministering. Or he that teacheth on teaching. Or he that exhorteth on exhortation. He that giveth, let him do it with simplicity. He that ruleth with diligence. He that showeth mercy with cheerfulness. Let love be without dissimulation. Abhor that which is evil. Cleave to that which is good. Be kindly affectionate one to another with brotherly love and honor, preferring one another. Not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continuing instant in prayer, distributing to the necessity of the saints, given to hospitality. Bless them which persecute you, bless and curse not. Rejoice with them that do rejoice. Weep with them that weep. God commands us as saints to comfort people. If someone's rejoicing, come alongside them and rejoice with them. If they're weeping, come along with them and weep with them. Help them and experience their sorrow with them. Be there with them. Show mercy. Rule with diligence. Give, exhort, minister, teach, distribute, help people out as they need it throughout the church. Be hospitable. Be inviting. Be welcoming to people. There's so many ministries. There's a whole ministry of greeting people when they come to church, of ushering, of helping people know where to sit, where things are, making them feel welcome. That's a ministry in the church. God could give someone, we may not think about it this way too often, but God could give someone a special talent or a special gift, if you will, for doing that, for being an administrative administrative person, overseeing the finances or keeping track of the books or the law issues that could come up with a church. All these ministries are important, and I won't take the time to do it, but you could read more in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and more in 1 Peter chapter 4. So many ministries in the church. We want all of them. I'm not going to cover them all today. They're all important, but they all need to fit into the structure that God has given us. And so, to answer the questions that we started with, who's in charge around here? Well, what is that question? That's a question of authority. Who's in charge? So that would be the person who's overseeing, or the bishop. Who do I go to when I need prayer for sickness? Well, that's a little bit more of a ministry thing. We have Bishop Hanson will pray for plenty of people when they come down to get prayed for. The elders will too. You could go to that's what our prayer groups are for. That's a ministry that's taking place. So, if I'm sick, I'm going to get someone with a lot of faith to pray for me. I need counseling. Well, that starts with the bishop, and most of the time, as far as I know, he does most of the counseling. Maybe he would refer you to someone else at some point. I don't know. But the point is, just because someone seems like they'd be really good at giving wise counsel, and that's great, but I'm going to go to my bishop first because he's the spiritual authority. Now, if he wants me to talk to someone else, if he wants to introduce a book or something I should listen to or whatever into it, that's his call. I'm going to start with my authority, and then if he delegates that off to a ministry, that's his call. Someone gave me a word. What do I do with that? Well, that's a matter of authority. Here, if someone gives someone else a word, we submit that to the man of God. And I believe now he also, the elders can do that as well. And maybe this is weird. Well, that is a good point. Maybe it is weird. But you know what? A lot of things are weird until we get used to them. And if they work, they stick around. Cars were weird at one point, right? It's like, wow, what's that thing going down the street? But they worked, and they were useful, so they stuck around. People kept buying them. And so I think that when it comes to important things, you'll find that they last, and that they endure, and that they are faithful. And there's a lot of churches that do things a little bit differently than we do, and I think every church is unique to itself. But you'll find that there's, at this church, just a strength and a depth, and we're just trying to do what God has given us to do, to make the most of the opportunities that he has given us to accomplish our mission and our goal, which is to reach as many people as possible and be able to have leaders that are being trained and are raised up so that they can also reach, so that there can be more and more ministry and more influence. More and more people are being influenced and brought in. And that's the whole point of this structure. That's the whole point of what God has given us to do. It's not to have some theory or some cute concept about how we do this. We're trying to reach people. We're trying to get into all these surrounding towns that don't have churches, that don't have the truth in them, and get Bible studies started and prayer groups started, and maybe someday other campuses or other congregations or maybe even other churches planted there as God leads, as that's God's plan, has that figured out. I don't have any idea how it will all unfold, but I know that God wants us to reach people. And this is at the heart of how we do that. So with that, we've come to the end, and I'm going to dismiss.